Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Okay. There's some construction stuff going on upstairs in the room I usually record in, but I gotta be down here for the time being, which is fine. But because whenever I unplug my mic, it always resets the filter settings to default, and I have to go through again and through all these knobs and test where the sweet spot was. I really should take a picture of all this. But I did a test run for the audio. It doesn't seem that bad. And I'm using the integrated webcam instead of the other one, but that looks fine too. So sorry if it seems extra, like a little strange, some of the settings, but gotta deal with that, adapt. Let's go. Original link to the video, top of the description. Below that, link to the Discord. Would love to have you. Click on it, send you right over there. Don't be shy. Makes it easier for me to interact with you, talk to you, get to know you. Can be fun. Let's go. Enough stalling. Preemptive like. Almost Kings, Princes of Wales who missed out.
Hi,
Useful charts. Awesome. Hi.
my name is Jack Rackham. For centuries, the
watched your
title
video
Prince of Wales has been given to the
2 days
man
ago.
who will become the future King of England, or Great Britain, or the United Kingdom. But as Queen Elizabeth recently celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, her 70th year on the throne, there's two things that have come up. First is this new limited edition chart of the British monarchy available for sale as a poster on
Get it.
usefulcharts.com. And
I gotta
second
get some
are more
Useful Charts
jokes that the
posters.
current Prince of Wales, her son Prince Charles, will never become king because
I asked how you guys think of him, a past video about the royal family, and there seem to be not too many extreme I hate him or extreme I love him, and just kind of a middle guy. Poor guy just wants to be king, waiting his turn patiently. Why won't you die? Okay, sorry, go.
he simply can't outlive his mother. Well, as it so happens, a full 1/3 of the men given the title Prince of Wales never became king. Of the 21 men with this title, 7 have missed out, either by dying before their fathers or by being deposed.
Are you telling me we almost had a King Arthur and we didn't, or you guys didn't? I say we whenever, yeah.
Today, I'm going to share with you these 7 would-be kings and take a look at what history might have looked like if any of them actually sat on the throne.
I'm sort of upset he didn't. Arthur didn't. Such a great channel, guys. I was sort of intimidated when I first saw this because there didn't seem to be a lot of pictures, which helped me learn better. Quiet. And just very like numbery and analytic-y, but it's awesome. It's really an amazing channel.
The first Prince of Wales not to become king was called Edward the Black Prince. He was a war hero on the English side of the 100 Years' War, who won the battles of Crécy and Poitiers. This was the first part of the war, where England was in the lead, so to speak. On top of his talent for battle, he was also involved in making negotiations with France, Castile, and Navarre, and was considered a model of chivalry. But his father, Edward III,
Why wasn't he at Agincourt? Didn't Agincourt happen right after? Never mind.
was
Different
in
topic.
Navarre, and was considered a model of chivalry. But his father, Edward III, was a very long-lived king who ruled for 50 years, and the Black Prince died just 1 year before his father. So instead of King Edward IV, England was ruled by Richard II, a 10-year-old boy who was later deposed for turning tyrannical. But had the Black Prince outlived his father, it's unlikely things would have turned out much differently. France was already turning the tide of the war before his death, and Richard II was the Black Prince's son.
Exactly.
So it's very likely he would have eventually become king anyway.
Yeah.
The next unfortunate Prince of Wales was another Edward, but this Edward lived during the Wars of the Roses. He was the son of Henry.
I need to learn to listen more, talk less, just take it in as I'm pausing and talking and not listening. Okay.
Eventually become king anyway. The next unfortunate Prince of Wales was another Edward, but this Edward lived during the Wars of the Roses. He was the son of Henry VI, and while rumors cropped up that he was secretly an illegitimate child fathered by another nobleman, there is, as far as we know, zero evidence to prove it. Now, the Wars of the Roses made being king
Ah! Henry V, what?
of England a very precarious and dangerous position, and Henry VI was kidnapped in 1460. Prince Edward's mother gathered an army to fight on the king's behalf and brought the young Edward along with her, but they failed to retake London. Edward lived in exile for many years until he was eventually killed in battle. Next, we have yet another Edward. This Edward was the son of the infamous Richard III, born in 1473 or 1476. He was Richard's only son, but he died in 1484, less than a year after his father became king. This time it was natural causes, but it's unclear exactly what did him in. Although it's interesting to imagine what a Yorkist line through Prince Edward might have looked like, Richard III was ultimately killed in battle, and his enemies had many reasons to oppose him beyond his lack of a son. And that battle was in 1485, meaning Edward would still have been a child. Even if he survived the war, there's not much he could have done to change things. The man who defeated Richard III became Henry VII.
I definitely get these two mixed up a lot. Like, if I ever see their face without a name, like on the internet, I definitely, I almost, like, it seems like the same guy. Because you can tell, like, with the hairdo is in style with, like, the guys with the straight kind of shoulder length hair. And these guys just look similar in paintings and stuff. So I got them mixed up.
His family was called House Tudor, but he was a descendant of the Lancasters, who married a Yorkist woman and put an end to the Wars of the Roses once and for all. Together, they had a son who would become the great hope of House Tudor, a boy named Arthur. That's right, England very nearly had a real King Arthur. Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon in the interest of forging an alliance with Spain, but Arthur died of sweating sickness without having any children. And that had some pretty... But Arthur died of sweating sickness without having any children. And that had some pretty serious consequences.
What does he have? What does he have? Like, what is the illness? Well, he's sweating a lot, so sweating sickness, I guess.
The immediate result was that Catherine married the new Prince of Wales, who grew up to become Henry VIII. Their marriage was unhappy and produced no sons who survived infancy, leading Henry to want an annulment, kind of like a divorce. But the Pope wouldn't allow it. Therefore, Henry VIII ultimately split away from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England. A world where Arthur grew up to be king would mean a world where England could have remained Catholic, which, as we'll see soon, would have a huge impact on its future history. But first, we have to talk about Prince Henry Frederick. He was a bright and promising heir to King James, the first Stuart monarch of England. His death presents an interesting hypothetical concerning the English Civil War. You see, if Henry Frederick had become king, Charles I would not have become king, and without his actions, there may have been no civil war, which means...
You know when, like, you see the same thing so often that you start to get it without really having to put effort in to memorize it? I should know this chart much better than I do with the amount of times I've seen it. Or not the chart, the tree in general. So Henry VIII,
no Cromwell, and an entirely different line of Stuarts inheriting the throne after him. That being said, the underlying issue of the Civil War was Parliament disagreeing with Charles's belief in the divine right of kings. Henry Frederick, who was just a teenager, mind you, was a very upright fellow who made anyone who swore in his presence pay a fine. And it's difficult to imagine a teenager with a swear jar wouldn't grow up to flex his royal prerogative. But as I said earlier, a Catholic England would be a very different timeline indeed, and not just because of the way it would have changed politics. Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth I, James I, Charles I, and Charles II were all Anglican Protestants. But in 1685, England had a Catholic monarch for the first time in over 100 years. His name was James II. James II actually had two...
Oh my god, all the frickin' Marys. marries Mary the First. What is that? Bloody Mary? Mary the First. Mary Tudor. Mary the First over here.
First
Mary Stuart. The Mary over here.
And Charles II were all Anglican Protestants. But in 1685, England had a Catholic monarch for the first time in over 100 years. His name was James II. James II actually had two sons who were supposed to become king. The first was James, Duke of Cambridge, but he was only 3 years old when he died and was never given the title Prince of Wales. The other James is known as the Old Pretender. When James II became king, many in England had a hard time accepting being ruled by a Catholic, but they...
Guys, I really think that happiness has to do with expectation. And so if our reality doesn't meet expectation, then we become sad. If our reality meets our expectation, we're content. If it exceeds it, we're happy. And seeing like all the child death, like the death of an infant, I'd imagine would have been a little more bearable to people back then because they knew of how great the possibility of them dying was. And so I'd imagine there was a lot of sort of distancing from very young children. And at least maybe for the father, right? You can't for the mother, right? You have to breastfeed or whatever. Maybe they had wet nurses or something. Isn't that but I'd imagine how much more used these people were to death. I bet you death was a much more acceptable thing for both you and your family. And in a way, that's sort of it's a good thing for back then, so you don't get completely devastated. Did I make sense, or did I sound like a psychotic person?
They were especially appalled at the prospect of a Catholic dynasty. Before James the Pretender was born, King James' heir was his daughter Mary, a Protestant who married a Dutchman named William of Orange. After Prince James was born, William, who had his own claim to the throne because he was James's nephew, invaded England. This was the first and only successful invasion since 1066, but it's often not counted because some powerful English politicians actually invited him to invade, and there was very little fighting that took place.
Doesn't count.
William and Mary reigned as co-monarchs. Meanwhile, Prince James fled to France with his father. When James II died in 1701, the Old Pretender claimed the crowns of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He attempted to invade England with the support of the powerful French King Louis XIV in 1708, but he couldn't make landfall. He came to Scotland when his supporters revolted in what's called the Jacobite Uprising in 1715, but had no success. Louis XIV died that same year, and France allied with England.
That's a term that used to confuse the heck out of me. I just didn't know what it was, the Jacobites, but now I have a comfortable understanding. Not as much as I would like, but better than always being very confused.
But had no success. Louis XIV died that same year, and he came to Scotland when his supporters revolted in what's called the Jacobite Uprising in 1715, but had no success. Louis XIV died that same year, and France allied with England, killing most hope for the Jacobite line. Although his son, the young Pretender, engaged in another unsuccessful uprising in 1745. But what if the Old Pretender wasn't just a pretender? What if the Jacobite uprising was successful and he became king? We actually made a video on this channel all about who the kings and queens of England would have been had James, Prince of Wales, become King James III, and we traced his line all the way to today. You can check out the link in the description. The last Prince of Wales who never got his hands on the crown was Frederick, son of George II. He would have been the only King Frederick in England's history. It was a much more popular name for German kings, but then again, he was from the House of Hanover, who were originally German. Prince Frederick is very much an example of a royal living under parliamentary sovereignty, because unlike the Black Prince, who spent his life leading armies and taking charge of diplomacy, Frederick spent most of his time engaging with sports and arts and other recreational activities. In fact, he wrote a play with a friend of his, and despite packing the theater full of soldiers...
So he spent his time playing squash and hanging out at the pool at the country club.
It was so bad he had to give the audience their money back. All this to full activities. In fact, he wrote a play with a friend of his, and despite packing the theater full of soldiers, it was so bad he had to give the audience their money back. All this to say, a King Frederick of England would not have made the world a very different place. He died before his father, but he was himself the father of George III, who did
Satan himself
become king. So that's 7, but before we go, I want to wrap up with a couple honorable mentions.
Victoria, my
These two
queen.
individuals never received the title Prince of Wales, but they were in line for the throne. The first is Princess Charlotte of Wales, the daughter of King George IV. Now, there's a very important distinction in saying Princess Charlotte of Wales and Charlotte, Princess of Wales. Princess of Wales is a title only held thus far by the wife of a Prince of Wales, and Charlotte was known as Charlotte of Wales because her father was the Prince of Wales. But, you might ask, what about if a woman is the heir? After all, the current queen was the heir apparent at one point.
How did that make sense?
Her father, Prince of Wales, and Charlotte was known as Charlotte of Wales because her father was the Prince of Wales.
Ah, I see. So rather than a wife.
But, you might ask, what about if a woman is the heir? After all, the current queen was the heir apparent at one point in time, as was Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth I. Well, in the case of the two Elizabeths, their fathers had thought about naming their daughters Princess of Wales, but ultimately they granted them the rights of the heir apparent without that specific title.
She's my favorite monarch, Queen Victoria. Or I guess it's not really fair because I don't really even know a lot that she did. I just know that she was the queen of the British Empire when I think of the British Empire, she was the queen. Like when I think of the glorious, like the British Empire, I think of the 1800s, maybe latter 1800s. And that's when she was, Victorian era. I love that. Just thinking about it. I love that era in history.
Anyway, the question was never asked about Princess Charlotte. When she died giving birth to a stillborn son, she predeceased both her father, the Prince of Wales, and her grandfather, the king. At the time, she was George III's only grandchild, which caused a bit of a crisis in the royal family until Queen Victoria was born.
Imagine dying giving birth to a stillborn kid, so the kid obviously didn't live. Oh, that would suck, because at least if you know you're dying and you at least have your bloodline continues, or that's horrible.
Finally, there was Albert, son of Edward VII. He was a military man who didn't see active duty and a grandson of Queen Victoria. He married Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, and I have to imagine it might have been weird.
Christ. How is that possible? Why? Like, it really reminds me of, like, the, like, feet binding, or, like, in China, or, like, in some African tribes, the rings, that go up, like, that they attach on the neck of the women. It's just, one, how is that attractive? How did the men find that? And, two, that must have deformed your insides, and
being married to someone with the same name as your grandmother. He died of influenza in 1892, predeceasing his father and grandmother, but Victoria Mary did become queen because she married Albert's younger brother, George V, in 1910. In the mid-20th century, rumors began to circulate that Albert was actually Jack the Ripper, that he had an affair in the brothels of London and accidentally fathered a child, leading him to murder the mother and several other prostitutes who might have known her.
Then how does that explain all the crazy, weird, crazy satanic level mutilation of the... Yeah, great story. I like it. It's a cool plot, but... what's it? Occam's razor? Is that the one where it's like the most likely is the simplest? Yeah, cool story, but I'm gonna say no.
In order to cover it up. It's a titillating story, but it turns out there's proof of him being 500 miles away in Scotland during the time of some of the murders. All right, that was a quick look at some of the rulers England narrowly missed out on, and hopefully a fun peek into the lives of the royal family throughout the centuries.
He could have been in Paris or in London on the same block at the time of the and I would still be like, I don't think it's him.
Once again, this British monarchy family tree chart is available for purchase at usefulcharts.com for a limited time only, and thanks for watching.
Thanks for making. Watch another video, buy posters, guys, and follow them.
Hi, this is Matt Baker.
I haven't seen
As
it.
you might know,
Matt Baker, where do I know that? Where do I know you, sir? I hope you guys enjoyed that and can answer my questions. Matt Baker. I know that name. Maybe I don't. Okay, never mind. Okay, see you guys next time. Bye.